Welcome to the second session of our class, and it's called The Long Reach and Cataclysm of World War I, presented today by Dr. Fred Johnson. And this session today, the second week, is called Lessons That Should Have Been Unforgettable. And that would have been from 1914 to 1916. Please let's all welcome our presenter, Dr. Fred Johnson.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning, good morning. It is good to see you, even if it's virtually. I am in the midst of, this is the part of the semester where midterm exams are given. And I have to tell you all that when I have joked around and said before, do my students ask this question, will it be on the test? They really do ask that question. I'm so happy that you all don't. So go ahead and get started. Like Kit pointed out, the session today, World War I, Part 2, 1914 to 1916, lessons that should have been unforgettable. And the description that I gave on that and putting the class together was the descent into war in 1914, followed by the increasing horrors and brutalities of industrial modern warfare. And when we're talking about World War I, we should really understand that, yes, it's modern war, but we need to add a condition to that, a qualifier to that, a statement of description to that. Industrial modern warfare. Think of warfare where just like General Motors is dedicated to making cars and Boeing is dedicated to making airplanes and everything having to do with airplanes, and where, you know, farms are dedicated to making food and all that kind of stuff. Think about entire societies that have their government, their industry, their science, their engineering, their economies, their social philosophy, everything dedicated to the enterprise or the enterprise or the production of warfare and war weapons. That's industrial modern warfare. And when you put it in those terms, anything can happen. Moving right along, it did not take long to communicate that humanity had made a colossal error. The weapons of war, combined with the depravity of human nature, taught lessons of horror and misery that should have been unforgettable, but weren't. Think about that. Industrial modern warfare added to human nature. You don't need atomic weapons to understand that the combination of those two things is going to produce some catastrophic consequences. In 1914, before the world went to war, the map looked like this. We talked about this last week. With the United Kingdom and Great Britain was sitting off by itself, but it was in alliance with France and Russia, and Germany and Austria and Hungary dominated Central Europe. On August 3rd, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium. And when Germany invaded Belgium, what that did was it initiated, or it was a trigger for Great Britain to respond to an 1839 treaty it had signed with Belgium to protect Belgian neutrality. And when Great Britain came into World War I or into the conflict, then all the major powers, or what would become all the major powers of Europe, were finally involved in this terrible, terrible land conflict. You see here German troops invading Belgium, another view of it. Please bear with me as I read. Germany invaded neutral Belgium on 4 August 1914. From the next day, civilians were executed en masse as the invasion force advanced on its first obstacle, the ring of forts around Liège. To retaliate for the shelling from these forts, the German troops rounded up inhabitants of surrounding villages. Victims were selected and shot, those still alive being killed off with bayonets. By August 8th, nearly 850 civilians were dead. By then, several of the dynamics of this particular type of violence had fully emerged. First, the massacres occurred where the invading army suffered setbacks. The German military did not consider Belgium's military defense to be legitimate. Second, the victims were accused incorrectly of being civilian snipers. Third, there were women, children, and old men among the victims, but the vast majority were men of military age. The invading troops resented them for still enjoying the civilian life that they themselves had so recently been torn from. Fourth and last, the massacres went together with rituals designed to show civilians how helpless they were. People were made to cheer the troops. Local dignitaries, mayors, priests were publicly mistreated, in some cases killed. And keep in mind, this is the opening of the war. So if you want to put it in a somewhat macabre sense, this was the high point. Things went downhill with exponential rapidity from this point forward. The opening curtain, rising of the curtain on the World War I meant with this kind of thing happening, and we should also take this as a marker for what's going to happen later on in 1915, 1916, 1917, 1918, for why the wrath of the French in the world will come down so heavily upon the Germans, especially in the articulation of the Treaty of Versailles, which of course is another foundation for future conflict. This would be a war unlike no other. Now let's take this one step at a time. The first factor. Before World War I, the world was enjoying or engaging in what I call blissful hubris. That is arrogance over confidence on a scale that seems so incredible now in hindsight. I take for an example of that, this guy right here, Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, who lived from 1840 to 1914, the first year of the war. And it's so ironic that Admiral Mahan died in 1914, because in many ways, he exemplified so many of the thoughts, so many of the feelings, so much of the overconfidence, the assumptions that helped to bring the war on. We know that when nations attack each other, that physically a provocation, flying planes into the World Trade Center, attacking Pearl Harbor, any leader of a nation worth their salt has no choice but to respond to that. But it's the atmosphere, the feeling, the distrust, the hostility, all the things before that that brings an attack into fruition, that makes it happen. Alfred Thayer Mahan was an American who, like many Europeans, represented blissful hubris. The book that he was really known for was Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1890. Alfred Thayer Mahan was of the opinion by the late 19th century where he said the following: war now not only occurs more rarely, but is an occasional excess from which recovery is easy. Can I just say that if you're a strategist and you're saying that war occurs more rarely, and even if it does occur, it's not all that bad and you can easily recover from it, that is setting up conditions so that those who are aggressive or inquisitive are more inclined to engage in warfare. This is why I mentioned to you all last week that European leaders who also thought the same way, I'm focusing upon Admiral Mahan right now, but many European leaders and European strategists thought the same way. They had conquered Africa. They were conquering and colonizing Asia. The European Second Industrial Revolution was well on its way. The momentum was going. The quality of living wasn't going well for everybody, but compared to the Middle Ages and the Age of Exploration, Europe was experiencing something of a renaissance. Creature comforts, recreation, vacations were becoming more and more commonplace. The standard of living, people's wages per capita were increasing. And the last major conflict on European soil was the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War that, after all, had lasted only 6 weeks. And indeed, there had been a quick recovery. So from 1871 to 1881 to 1891 to 1901 to 1911, you're looking at close to 40 years, going on a half century, where Europe had not experienced a major conflict. And with industry expanding and technological advances being made, the invention of the airplane, the transatlantic cable, radio, it seemed like science was just making life more wonderful and more wondrous. And then the last time they had a war was 50 years earlier. Indeed, many people thought that war had basically been conquered and that humanity had reached this plateau of achievement and civilization to where war was an occasional luxury you could afford to engage in just to make sure that your masculine chops, your masculine abilities were still intact. Just a little workout for your army. Well, you can see what kind of a problem that would present. For the case of the Americans, in a classic case of be careful what you wish for, in 1898, with that idea of wanting to join the nations of France, England, Germany as colonizers, the United States by the end of 1898 and by 1900 after the Spanish-American War, we ended up with an island or Pacific empire that included the Hawaiian Islands, Johnson Atoll, Kingman Reef, Palmyra, Howland, but specifically moving further west, Wake Island, Guam, and especially the Philippines. Now, as the previous slide said, we should be careful what we wish for, because people wanted to join the Imperial Club, and we did. We also got Guantanamo Bay, which we still own, Puerto Rico, some other areas in the Caribbean. But while you're expanding into the Pacific, in the same time period, there was another nation expanding into the Pacific called Japan. That definitely set up a trajectory for some future consequences and conflict. The second factor that would make World War I, the industrial modern war, so difficult, so horrific, so terrible, was what I call isms and rogues. Now, I was going to get deeper into this last week, but it's more appropriate to talk about it this week. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was plagued by what the late Dr. Joachim Remak called 5 organic weaknesses. Weaknesses that led to the outbreak of World War I. An unrestrained press. And think today in our time about whether you watch CNN, MSNBC, Fox, Al Jazeera, read The Economist. We are at a point now where if you're a good critical thinker, you're sampling from all different sources to get your information and filter out what to you as a critical thinker is the truth. Then there are mediums like Facebook, where people with any kind of idea have the ability to put anything out there, to the point where they're having to manage that now, and we're going back and forth on free speech and excesses of speech and so on. And there are other online platforms. If you think of today's unrestrained press as being the internet, that is our time's unrestrained press. If you just think about the confusion that is causing, the fear that is causing, the misinformation and disinformation, think about that 100 years earlier, instead of just regular newspapers. So unrestrained press, where people are knowingly and willfully engaging in inflammatory language. It was called yellow journalism inside the United States, and it's one of the major factors that led President William McKinley basically boxed him into a corner to go to war with Spain. Second, there was unrestrained nationalism, unrestrained imperialism, historical and contemporary grievances, shifting and entangling alliances. Unrestrained nationalism. When Kaiser Wilhelm came to power and he said that what he wanted to do, he wanted to make sure that Germany had its place in the sun. He wasn't talking about becoming part of the European Economic Community. There was no EEC at that point, no European Union. Every nation was in it for itself. And every nation was not only in it for itself, but every nation was in it for itself at the expense of its neighbors. So what was important was not so much being a member, not being a European, it was being a German and speaking the German language, or being an Englishman speaking the English language and English history and English law. Everything was exaltation of the state. Unprecedented imperialism, as I shared with you all. The late 19th, early 20th century was a dizzying pace of imperialism, particularly when it came to the continent of Africa. If you look at a map of Africa before 1900, and then look at a map of Africa in 1914, it looks like night and day. European nations dominated the continent except for Eritrea and Liberia. Liberia was, and to some extent still remains, an American outpost, and Ethiopia was unconquered. The Italians tried to conquer Ethiopia. The Italians were beat in 1896 at the Battle of Ottawa, a defeat that humiliated them because, to put it bluntly, Italy was the only white European nation that had failed to conquer Africans. So instead of being something they could be proud of and just boast about, it became a black mark on them, or it became a blotch on their record. And when Mussolini comes to power in the 1920s and into the 1930s, he will revisit Ethiopia by invading that country and imposing one of the most brutal conquests of the pre-World War II period. Then historical and contemporary grievances. This period where World War I broke out, also known as the Balkans area, I mentioned to you all last week that in the Balkans area, they always had their ethnic problems. So many different ethnic nationalities, religions, Muslims, Jews, Christians of varying types, and Muslims of varying types, and different histories and different languages, and people wanting their own autonomous zones to rule themselves. And of course, they wanted those autonomous zones to rule themselves because their larger rulers, in many cases, in European history have been absolute rulers, meaning that they had absolute control over people, and usually they were very repressed. So of course, people after going through years of that wanted to shake off the shackles of oppression and chart their own course, sometimes democratic, sometimes not. And then shifting and entangling alliances. All those other things that I've mentioned up to now, unrestrained press, unrestrained nationalism, unprecedented imperialism. You're talking about an international system of hyper competitiveness, where people are constantly jockeying for power and shifting around and making secret deals and hooking, connecting with this person over here, connecting with that person over there, all to advance individual national priorities. And I get that, it's called national interest. But the problem was that many of these alliances were secretive. So just like with the Belgian neutrality treaty between the Belgians and the British in 1839, if you didn't know about that kind of thing, and we can't possibly know now if Germany would have invaded Belgium and Luxembourg, even if they had known. But here's what we do know. They didn't know about it. And because they didn't know, or if they didn't know, they ignored it. They didn't believe that the British would follow through on their commitment to the Belgians. They invaded, Britain responded, and the world went to war. Let me just read this real quick. Yellow journalism was rampant throughout the late 19th century world. For the first time, more people were literate than illiterate, which encouraged the growth of mass circulation newspapers. Now, newspapers, just like today, when you're watching MSNBC or watching CNN, I know that by watching MSNBC, oftentimes their commentators and their contributors will have written the book, and they'll say like, this introducing so-and-so who just wrote their book. So it becomes, yeah, they're talking and giving their opinion, but they're also hawking their wares. So there's kind of like a dual or sometimes trilateral purpose there. In Europe and the United States, journalists learned that bad news, watch this. Journalists learned that bad news, crises, alliance, and war stimulated and sometimes even created circulation. All right? So I have told my students that when it comes to headlines, if it smells, it sells. If it bleeds, it leads. This is a quote from Edward Willis Scripps of the Scripps Papers from the Ohio University Archive. Our business is to get an audience. Whatever else it is, our newspaper must be excessively interesting, not to the good, wise men, and pure in spirit, but to the great mass of sordid, squalid humanity. This gives you an idea of what he thought about his readers. Humanity is vulgar, so we must be vulgar. It is coarse, so we must not be refined. It is passionate. Therefore, the blood that flows through our newspapers must be warm. I translate that to mean that, according to Mr. Edward Willis Scripps, he was going to sit up there and make a race to the very bottom to appeal to the worst features of human nature, to appeal to the worst possibilities of human society. He's not looking to be philanthropic and change the world in poverty, in homelessness, and in hunger. He's looking to sell papers. And if it's done by creating stories that expand warfare and glorify warfare and emphasize warfare, or the worst of humanity, if it sells a paper, that's what it sounds like he was prepared to do. Unrestrained nationalism. We talked about that. Here's a map of the ethnic groups of Austria-Hungary in 1910. Look at the collection here. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Croats and Serbs, Romanians, Italians. This is why the Austro-Hungarian leaders, Franz Joseph, and before he was assassinated, Franz Ferdinand, but specifically Franz Joseph, always referred to what they call their ethnic problem. You can just imagine that with centuries-old animosities, centuries-old memories, and different religions and disagreements over religion and so many other things, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a seething hive of discontent, which is why when the Serbians assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarians saw that as their opportunity to once and for all to crush their ethnic problem. They miscalculated in a terribly significant way. I touched upon this last week. So I discussed this last week, so I'll touch upon it only this morning. Just about all of the leaders of Europe, the military leaders and definitely the political leaders of Europe at the time of World War I were born either in or just after the middle of the 19th century. So 40 to 50 years before 1900, most of the leaders of Europe in 1914, they were children of the 19th century who now were going to fight a modern industrial war. Now look, these guys were smart, they were brilliant, they were experienced, but they were still also children of the 19th century. When I say they're smart, brilliant, and experienced, that means that they were fast learners. They could learn the ways of modern warfare quickly, but the only problem with that is when people who are not acquainted with the technology of the new way of warfare have to learn it and the war is already underway, what that means is that the cost of their learning curve are going to be hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of young people that pay the price for their education. The fourth factor, lessons that should have been learned, lessons that should have been unforgettable, the modern tools of annihilation, building these destructive weapons like the machine gun. The machine gun had a forerunner, among other things, a thing called the Gatling gun. Now, the Gatling gun was used on the American frontier in the latter part of the 19th century in what was called let's call it the Plains Wars against Native Americans. The Gatling gun proved to be very effective and, let's just say, literally shooting out the last gasp of Native American resistance to try and hang on to their land, their history, their way of life. Dr. Richard Gatling, for whom the gun is named after, said the following: "It occurred to me that if I could invent a machine, a gun, which could by its rapidity of fire enable one man to do as much battle as 100, that it would to a large extent supersede the necessity of large armies, and consequently exposure to battle and disease would be greatly diminished." I would say that Dr. Gatling miscalculated. The Gatling gun, as I mentioned, was a powerful weapon, and it had an adjunct or a cousin in what was called the Maxim gun, another forerunner of the machine gun invented by Hiram Stevens Maxim. This weapon, the Maxim gun and variations of it, are what allowed the English and the French and the Germans to some extent to conquer Africa. And I want to emphasize here that yes, Africa was conquered and eventually colonized, as I mentioned, except for Liberia and Ethiopia. But don't make any mistake about this. Africans fought back in any way they could, sometimes with wiliness and shrewdness, sometimes with direct confrontation. In the case of a guy named Samari Touré, he basically took French weapons, set up his own factory, re-engineered them, and started his own arms production process. But in the end, technology, numbers, and 3 centuries of hollowing out a population from the transatlantic slave trade all combined to make those African kingdoms collapse inward on themselves, and the Europeans took over the continent. This is a British Vickers machine gun used early in the war and throughout the war, in this example here. The introduction of the machine gun and other modern weapons or tools of annihilation, in many cases, changed tactics. And I think one of the best film representations of that was in the film that came out a few years ago entitled War Horse. At the start of World War I, there were still people that had this notion that cavalry charges, like the kind that they had in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, that it was a glorious kind of thing to do. We know that during the Civil War, General James Ewell Brown Stewart was the leader of Confederate cavalry, which was considered to be the eyes and ears, the intelligence gathering force of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. In fact, when Jeb Stuart was killed at Yellow Tavern in 1864, the Confederate Army lost a great, great asset. They lost their like I said, the reconnaissance capability of the Army of Northern Virginia. But by 1914 with the machine gun, it turned out very quickly that cavalry charges were a thing of the past, as indicated by this film clip. Let me get out of this first. Here we go.
Good luck, my friends. Walk! Walk! Walk!
In 1853 to 1856, during the Crimean conflict, an army, seeing a group of men charging at them on horseback with swords drawn, that would be enough to send an army into retreat. In 1914, one man behind a machine gun could stand his ground as that same group of horses with men on them ran at them. Tactics changed after that. No more cavalry charges. And then there was this weapon of annihilation, the gas. The gas that was used during World War I. Now, when it came to the gas, you see these British soldiers here who have suffered, they've been blinded, or they've had their eyes either irritated or scorched by mustard gas. And then this guy's got skin blisters from mustard gas. Another guy whose skin has been blistered by mustard gas. The other thing to recognize about these modern tools of annihilation, and I say tools of annihilation, these are not just tools of destruction or weapons of destruction. Weapons of destruction are designed to, well, destroy, which is bad enough. But annihilation, that means removing from the face of the earth. At the end of World War I, when there are whole towns and villages that are gone, people who were here but now no longer, animals, everything you can imagine touched by the hand of warfare. Part of it was because of the new modern horrors of war, or as I share with you all, one of my students said in the foreign policy class that humanity took the horrors of war, which were bad enough, and then invented new horrors to make it even more horrible. The facial reconstruction that had to occur because of World War I. In other words, what human ingenuity did to humanity in World War I was changing something that I call the cultural war. How human beings understood warfare to be from the last conflict. By World War I, not only was it brand new, but they were developing as every day the war went on. Every year that it transpired, people had to rearrange how they came to understand warfare. It was different than before. They didn't know what it was going to be, but they understood, at least in that time period, from 1914 to 1916, they understood that this war, as it was evolving, as the nature and techniques of warfare were evolving and the methods of war were changing, and the type of warfare became even more horrific, more terrible, more difficult to recover from. It became more intense. That destruction became even more powerful. That's why they eventually coined the phrase, "This must be the war to end all wars." Humanity was saying collectively, we have never seen or done anything like this before, and we can't afford to do this again. Of course, we know that they will, but that just goes to explain to you, to emphasize the profundity of the changes that society and nations were going through during World War I. Now, one individual is a case named Fritz Haber. The story of Fritz Haber is one of amazing brilliance and Shakespearean tragedy. So I'd like to take a moment to share with you a Radio Lab presentation that talks about the curious case and tragedy of Fritz Haber, the guy who was behind the Germans inventing gas and then using gas for the first time in warfare at Ypres in 1915.
That can help you turn your fresh idea into a top-notch website. Go to squarespace.com/Radiolab for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use the offer code Radiolab to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
WNYC is teaming up with NPR to bring you a new daily podcast, Consider This. We'll bring you the biggest news stories and what's happening in our community to help you make sense of the day. Subscribe to Consider This wherever you get your podcasts.
Listener supported. WNYC Studios.
Oh, okay.
They're going to record it. I'm going to record it here too.
All right, 3, 2, 1. Hey, I'm Chad Abumrang.
I'm Robert Krulwich.
This is Radiolab, and today, evil? Although, I don't know if that's the right word for this next thing.
Yeah, because it's sort of
More complicated.
When you call someone evil, then you're kind of done with them.
Yeah.
But there's been a fellow, I've been thinking about him for a better part of the year, as you know. He's such a puzzle to me. I can't quite place him.
Though it's very fun to try.
And I heard about him from science writer Sam Keane. Well, let's talk about Fritz Haber. So first of all, could you just when did he live and what did he look like and that kind of stuff?
He was doing his great science work right around the turn of the 20th century, so right around 1900. Very distinctive looking man, bald on top, trim, nice mustache, wore a little pince-nez. Is that how you say that? Is that how you
I think
pronounce
I call it pince-nez, so I'm not sure.
Pince-nez? Okay, one of those very tiny old-fashioned pair of glasses that would pinch on your nose. And he was someone who had very big ambitions.
Just to put that in context, and to bring a few other of our storytellers in.
He comes from Breslau, Germany,
That's Fred Kaufman, reporter.
which is a fairly small, smallish sort of town. And so does Clara,
That's Fritz Haber's wife.
We're going to meet her later.
right? Clara comes from the same town. And they're both secularized Jews.
This was a moment in German history, he says, when Jews had a decent amount of freedom.
And this is the difference between Kaiser Wilhelm and, of course, Hitler's Germany.
Yeah.
Is-
Put it in context.
Dan Charles, he's a historian.
His was the first generation when a young Jewish boy could truly imagine that he could just be a regular part of that society. He could do anything.
And he believed it. Fast forward 10 years, Fritz Haber is a professor.
Small university.
He's working with chemicals. It's about 1880.
And he throws himself at one of the central issues facing Germany at that time.
Germany has a problem.
A big problem.
It has enough, what they used to call then solar energy,
Energy from the sun to grow crops.
to feed about 30 million people. However, that leaves behind 20 million Germans.
You mean they're looking at 20 million people going hungry?
That's what we're heading towards. I mean, you have to remember, during the Crimean War in the 1850s, Europe starves.
So around the turn of the century, for German scientists like Haber, this was the challenge.
He wants to feed Germany.
And actually, this wasn't just a German thing. A lot of people were beginning to worry that with about 1.5 billion people on the planet at that point, that maybe we were maxing out, that the Earth couldn't support this many people.
And everyone thought, well, we know the solution.
Yeah, we just need a whole lot more of one simple element.
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen.
They needed more.
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen is an essential part of amino acids and protein.
And when you stick a seed, like a wheat seed, in the ground,
One of the reasons it grows is because it's sucking up all the nitrogen in the soil.
to make its cell walls,
Without nitrogen, you don't have life.
now, of course, you could find some nitrogen out in the world.
Natural deposits would be like seaweed, or
Manure was one.
You could find it in cow manure or
Guano,
which was basically
bat poop, and seagull poop.
which made that poop
valuable.
And actually, 2 nations in South America went to war.
literally over bat.
You could say people were bat crazy.
By the way, that's reporter Latif Nasser.
This was like oil is today. This is
Everybody was desperate for new sources of nitrogen, and to make the problem even more annoying,
the most common source of nitrogen is in the air around us. It makes up 4 out of every 5 or so molecules that we breathe. So it's
so
very,
it's a lot.
yes, 80% of the air is nitrogen atoms.
So all the nitrogen you'd ever need,
Was right there.
Like, you can't throw that air onto a plant. They couldn't deploy it.
Meaning they couldn't capture it.
That's right. And part of the problem here, and although once again we're getting a little ahead of ourselves,
we'll be right back to Haber, but wait, let's just finish this.
is that nitrogen is trivalent.
Trivalent.
In other words, nitrogen has really strong attachments to itself.
What he means is that when nitrogen atoms are just free floating in the air, they will cling to each other. These little nitrogen atoms will fiercely hold together, and it's almost impossible to pry them apart.
His calculations showed that it couldn't be done.
At least not without a
Tremendous amount of energy.
More energy than seemed like
possible to make.
Yeah, yes, but
being ambitious.
Haber starts thinking, in order to do this, we need to pressure this. We need to put it under a lot of pressure.
So he starts experimenting. He figures out a way to take a lot of air that's filled with these little nitrogen bonds clinging to each other and pump it
To a big iron tank.
under extreme pressure
at high temperature,
and then he forces hydrogen into the tank.
Get in there.
and you have a number of chemical reactions. And what happens is that you're elbowing the nitrogen apart from itself and then forcing it to bond with the hydrogen in a new way.
And when hydrogen and nitrogen bond together, the thing you get
Is ammonia.
a liquid that has captured the nitrogen right out of the air.
You literally get a drip of ammonia. It is arguably the most significant scientific breakthrough of them all.
Bread from the air was the phrase.
Because Haber had figured out a way to take nitrogen from the air, put it into the barren ground, and grew wheat.
This has allowed the world to have 7 billion people. This is what's driving the world towards 10, 12 by 2050. Now we're seeing about 100 million tons of synthetic fertilizer produced industrially each year, and that tonnages then moves into our food source. Our food source then moves into our bodies, and the rough statistics are that half of each of our bodies contains nitrogen from the Haber process.
No,
Really? And so in 1918, Fritz Haber gets a Nobel Prize. But this is why this is such an interesting guy. Around this same time, officials in the US government are calling him a war criminal.
all right, just to back up for 1 second.
After Haber's nitrogen discovery,
He was promoted.
You know, he takes over leadership of this institute in Berlin, and he starts hobnobbing with a whole different level of society.
that's Stan Charles again.
I mean, it's a pretty heady thing for, you know, a Jewish kid from Breslau to be hobnobbing with the emperor and cabinet ministers. He's part of the club, and he really, really relished it.
And not just because he was vain, which everyone agrees he was, but because he loves his country.
He loves the fatherland and he loves Germany.
So
When World War I begins,
he signs up immediately, sends a letter volunteering for duty.
Saying, you know the process that I use to make food? Well, I can use that same process to make explosives. Because the thing that you put into the ground to grow more food is also the thing you can explode to make a bomb.
That's correct. Because it takes such energy and pressure to separate it, this trivalent bond is so strong that when it comes back together, that energy that's released, it could be used for life or death.
In any case,
back to World War I.
there's trench warfare, it gets bogged down, and Haber has an idea.
He goes straight to the German High Command and he pitches this idea.
He says, well, we can drive those enemy soldiers out of trenches with gas.
Chlorine gas.
We'll basically bring it to the front, and when the wind is right, we'll just spray it.
But the generals were not all that convinced.
No,
They just didn't like it.
A lot of them were like, this is not how you fight a war.
it's like playing dirty,
Yeah.
sort of unsportsmanlike.
But he organizes soldiers, he organizes whole gas units,
And nobody even had to ask.
takes command of them partially. He travels to the front.
And on April 22nd,
1915?
1915.
Haber finds himself in a little town in Belgium called Ypres.
Ypres. Actually, the Americans called it Ypres.
Whatever you call it.
This was one of the bloodiest arenas on the Western Front.
The Germans were on one side, the French, the Canadians, and the British on the other. And there, behind the German lines, is
Our friend, our frenemy, Fritz Haber. Our friend. He's bald. He has a pot belly. He has these pince-nez spectacles. He's chomping on a Virginian cigar. He was always smoking these Virginian cigars. And he's wearing a fur coat in what is basically like the Baghdad of his time.
But
Nobody had done what he was about to do on the scale that he was about to do it. So basically at 6 p.m. on April 22nd,
when the wind was just right, he says,
Haber's gas troops unscrew, they open the valves on almost 6,000 tanks containing 150 tons of chlorine. That's like an adult blue whale of chlorine.
I'm just trying to imagine that. Is that like a green cloud?
Some people describe it as a cloud, and then others describe it as this kind of 15-foot wall kind of hugging the land, and it's just sort of approaching. And it's moving at about 1 meter per second.
According to some accounts, as it crept across no man's land,
The leaves would just sort of shrivel, and the grass was turning to the color of metal. Birds would just fall from the air.
within minutes, the gas reached the Allied side, and as soon as it did, soldiers began to convulse.
They were gagging, they were choking. Hundreds of them were falling to the ground.
What is the gas doing to them exactly?
I think what it's doing is it's, if you breathe it in, it sort of irritates your lungs to the extent that they sort of fills up with fluid so quickly that you sort of drown in your own phlegm.
So they were actually drowning?
Literally drowning on land.
Wow.
Yellow mucus was frothing out of their mouths. Those who could still breathe would turn blue.
This is a description of hell.
Yeah.
But Haber saw it as a wonderful success and wished that the Germans had been better prepared to exploit it, because he felt like they really could have made a terrific advance if they had had more confidence.
And he is celebrated for it. He gets promoted to the rank of a captain.
And he goes home for a few days, a hero. But when he gets there, he has to contend with his wife,
Clara Immerwahr,
Clara.
also from Breslau, also from a Jewish family, and also a scientist, unusually so in those times.
She was actually sort of a genius herself. She was one of the first women to earn a PhD in her country.
And shortly after his return, Clara allegedly confronts him and says, "Look, you are morally bankrupt. How could you?"
But Haber just kind of ignored her, and
According to legend,
he actually threw a dinner party in celebration
of the big victory.
invited his friends over.
Now, we don't actually know if he threw a party.
I consider that apocryphal.
Dan doesn't think so. But what's clear is that he saw no reason to question what he had done, and that infuriated Clara.
Especially because she found out he was leaving the next day to direct more gas attacks.
And they probably had an argument.
Yeah,
Undoubtedly they had an argument.
That's historian Fritz Stern, who also happens to be Fritz Haber's godson.
they had a quarrel.
More than that.
Let's call it a fight.
And later that night,
After the party, Haber takes a bunch of sleeping pills, goes to sleep, and she takes his service revolver
Fritz Haber's pistol.
Walks outside to the garden.
and pulls the trigger.
Shoots herself
In the chest.
and is found by her son.
By her son.
Yes.
Age 13, I think.
And he finds her actually still alive with the life about to run out of her.
Haber, it's unknown what happens for the rest of that evening, but it is a well-documented fact that the very next morning,
on schedule.
He goes back to the front.
To the Eastern Front.
Leaving his son alone with his dead mother.
That's cold, huh?
Yeah.
Heartless.
It was a terrible moment.
Did he run away? Was it duty?
the son eventually, after he emigrates to America, kills himself.
See, now around this point, I just don't want to have anything to do with this guy. This is, I just want to take a shower and walk
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, me too. You know, on the other hand, I mean, if you look at the grand calculus, people he's helped or fed versus people he's killed, I mean, he's fed billions of people. I don't know that you could entirely call him bad. I might even tilt towards saying he's a little good, to be honest.
You wouldn't, though. Would you really? Would you really think that this guy's a good guy?
Honestly, yeah.
You know, just because of a mathematical summing up?
We're talking billions of people.
He's standing there on the front, pushing the gas into the lungs of other human beings. Now, admittedly, it's a war, but still. Then he goes and, and celebrates that, and then walks away from his child and his wife dead in the garden and says,
I think
"More of that, please."
Well, there's something distasteful about the fact that he was too into it. But like, I do think on some level you have to divorce the man from his deeds, and you got to ask, is the world better with him or without him? I think you got to answer it with him, right?
Well,
should we keep going with the story?
Yeah.
All right.
So, Sam, what happened to this guy after World War I?
He actually was very humiliated that Germany had lost, and especially humiliated over the fact that they had to pay enormous war reparations to other countries. So he decided he was going to invent a process to pay for these reparations by himself. And what he decided to do is go into the ocean, into seawater, which contains very small levels of gold. But, over the entire ocean, there's a lot of gold dissolved into the sea.
And he spends 5 years in a futile effort to distill gold from the ocean's waters.
Sounds insane. On the other hand, if anyone could do it.
He was trying to repeat this master stroke.
Needless to say,
he fails.
It was actually a crushing blow for him.
And then things really take a turn.
1933 comes, and Hitler takes over. And one of the first acts that the Nazis do is to
basically issue an order
that says there shall be no Jews in the civil service.
Now, Haber was Jewish, but because he'd served in World War I,
he technically would be exempt.
But 75% of the people who worked for him at the Institute, they were Jewish.
And they would have to be dismissed.
So he decides to take a stand.
And says, this is intolerable, I'm going to resign.
He says that he's always been hiring people based on how smart they are and not who their grandparents were.
So he sends a letter to the Ministry of Education resigning, and he leaves Germany. Telling a friend, he felt like he'd lost his homeland.
And then he starts this period of roaming. He eventually goes to England.
But in a famous incident, one of England's leading scientists refuses to shake his hand.
And he is basically homeless at this point. He's a man adrift.
Meanwhile,
his health is failing. In 1934, he takes a trip to Switzerland to a sanatorium.
But before he can get there,
his heart fails and he dies.
Now, there's a footnote to this that is very strange. I got a little.
Such was the tragic case of Fritz Haber. What they were saying about a footnote to this, the same technique that Fritz Haber had used to meld nitrogen and hydrogen, which helped solve a food problem, not just for Germany, but the world. That same research is what allowed him, or what enabled him to create the chlorine gas that was eventually used during wartime. The chilling part of his legacy is that in doing his research, he invented a byproduct called Zyklon. Zyklon B was eventually used by the Nazis in the death camps as the gas that killed millions of people in the concentration camps, millions of Jews, millions of people around the world. Still, that gas being owed to the research of Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber is singularly, simultaneously, a brilliant and utterly tragic individual in the story of warfare. Another lesson that should have been learned, that should have been unforgettable, what I call WSMDs, weapons of the soul and mind's destruction. I could have included gas in this and submarines and airplanes, but during World War I, humanity had never built the kind of weapons of soul and mind destruction like the artillery pieces built during World War I. Try and imagine what it must have been like to be under the artillery fire from weapons firing of this kind of size. This is why I keep on emphasizing engineering, manufacturing, metallurgy. It takes all those disciplines, all those skills, all the schematics, all the drawings, the best of human ingenuity, technology, skills, design, manufacturing, deployment, supply chain to build weapons this big. And these are not nearly as big as the weapons that they'll get to be in World War II. They put them on trains. During World War I, the Germans designed a gun that is capable of firing from the continent all the way across the channel into central England. and the byproduct of soldiers who sit up under, for example, the Battle of the Marne, the Somme, Belleau-Wood, different famous battles in World War I, artillery barrages that sometimes last for hours, sometimes days. What they don't realize, because no one's ever taken time to look into it, and because soldiers in warfare prior to this, even during the American Civil War, had never had to sit up and endure that kind of rain of artillery shells, is that the impact of all that on the mind and the body produced a thing called shell shock. Today we understand it as being combat fatigue, but more specifically, post-traumatic stress disorder. Doctors and commanders were being confronted with soldiers who literally were being shaken out of being rational because of the fear of these weapons and having to live up under them for hours at a time. These things were monstrous. And in addition to tearing up our bodies, in addition to ripping off faces, which is another issue that I'll get into next week, they simply just jangled people's spirits that had impact on the mind. So now warfare, which is already bad enough in tearing apart material, buildings, bridges, roads, railroad tracks, bodies, now is hitting at those esoteric, those intangible parts of human existence, the mind and the soul. And let's face it, to some extent, warfare has always had an impact on people's minds and souls, but now these weapons, they're not specifically designed to do though, but that's kind of beside the point. They do so nonetheless in a very big way. Bear with me as I read for this picture. This lone soldier surrounded by a mountain of empty shell cases in France. This lone British soldier up to his knees in spent shell cases offers a striking impression of the destruction that took place on the Western Front. However, this picture only tells half the story, with the other half of the story being the damage that the shells from these cases inflicted upon the enemy. Probably the craziest aspect of World War I was the so-called, here it comes, creeping bombardment. For those unfamiliar with the term, a creeping barrage is or was where artillery rounds were fired just in front of an advancing line of infantry. So let's establish the context of the picture of this. You're a soldier and you're marching in the advance. Someone's given the order to charge. You've come out of your trench, you climbed up the ladder, you have maneuvered your way through the barbed wire, and the artillery is timed so that it stays just in front of you as you're walking toward it. So the artillery rounds are timed to be landing in front of you, creeping toward the enemy that you're walking toward. One has to only hope and pray that the artillerists behind you don't miscalculate on their grid coordinate from where those rounds are supposed to fall. So you're literally seeing land exploding in front of you as you're walking in the direction of that kind of rain of fire. A creeping barrage was designed so as to place a curtain of artillery fire just ahead of advancing infantry, a barrage which would constantly shift or creep forward directly ahead of attacking troops. Such a method of artillery fire necessarily required very careful planning by both artillery and infantry commanders. I got to tell you all that I spent half of my time on active duty working with being assigned to an artillery battalion. So I learned, I'm not an artillerist, but I provided the communications, the radios, the crypto gear, the cryptology, all the call signs, everything, the antennas, everything that they needed to run artillery missions. So when you're providing the tools for the artillery people to launch what they call fire missions, then you have to learn all about artillery too, because artillerists think in a different kind of way than infantrymen do. And there's a thing called lifting and shifting fires. So you can have an artillery round or artillery mission that's designed to land on a certain spot. Then they say, I want you to lift and shift your fire. And it's all so well-timed and well-coordinated. When you start combining that with air power and naval gunfire, air power, air delivery, which is going to come at a certain point, what they call TOT, time on target. Then naval gunfire, if you're landing, you have an amphibious operation, heliborne landings, all these things have to be situated in a range so that artillery missions are launched either before or after soldiers are coming into an area. Before, then they lift and shift the fire, then you land, then you may have some other air support or some other type of, maybe mortar fire or naval gunfire, but it is so precisely planned. And of course, warfare is nothing if not chaotic. So the first thing that always sacrificed on the battlefield is the plan that was designed for the battle. It never actually goes according to plan. So do things go wrong? Of course they go wrong. Such a method of artillery fire necessarily required very careful planning by both artillery and infantry commanders, particularly with regard to timing if an army's own troops were not to be caught or held back by their own artillery barrage. As a rough rule of thumb, a creeping barrage would progress at the rate of approximately 50 meters per minute once an attack had begun. Listen, artillery is such a exacting science. I know that at Camp Lejeune, there was one incident where the base had a road that went around the entire base. And for the most part, nothing would ever happen. But I remember a particular day where this Marine Corps colonel's wife was driving somewhere on the base, coming to see him or something. But there was an artillery unit that was firing around, and the round fell short. The impact zone was beyond where the road was. The round fell short, and it just happened to hit her car as she was coming to see her husband on base. So I just cannot emphasize enough how important it was and is for artillery to be exact. And you can just imagine in the chaos of World War I, how many people lost their lives as a result. Other lessons that should have been unforgettable about World War I, the psychology of the war. World War I is going to see a massive use of propaganda. Anti-German propaganda. Anti-German propaganda that, as far as the United States is concerned, will cause many German American citizens or people who come to America from Germany or they have Germanic sounding names to anglicize them. Schmidt becomes Smith. If you're in America during World War I or after World War I and you're immigrated to the United States when there's a lot of anti-German hostility, you're not going to have a German sounding last name. So you can see this. This is a propaganda poster that is speaking against what they call the unrestrained submarine warfare. Again, another element of how the war was changing the culture of war, how we understand what war was. We always understand generically that war is killing, maiming, destruction, and so on, but the way that occurs, that's what was different. Look at this. The propaganda posters were very oftentimes so ham-fisted. Now this goes back to the opening of the war, where the Germans were sometimes drawn, and you'll see in just a moment, always looking upon to ravish women. And in this case, you literally have to close your eyes and not get what this one is about. You see the spiked helmet of German militarism, because many German soldiers wore the spiked helmet, which was like the Prussian military style of the day. And look at that. This ape, this beast, who's about to go do what with this poor innocent woman? He's holding her, and he's got in his right hand culture. So it's not just a war against militarism, which is on the helmet. Militarism, another one of those isms, destroy this mad brute. U.S. Army, enlist. So it's a cultural conflict as well. Civilization, one civilization against being uncivilized. And how can you mistake this one? The Kaiser, the German people, the German army's got blood on his hands up to his elbows. Beat back the Hun. Even during World War II, some people will hold over and still be referring to Germans as the Hun. So the propaganda, the psychological warfare during World War I, again, Belgium, the poor young woman Belgium, who was so mistreated, raped by Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. Hun or home. Very simple messages, not sophisticated, but it's a choice. Are you going to support the Hun or protect your home? If you're going to protect your home, buy more Liberty bonds, because war is expensive and it needs money, your money. So protect your home and vanquish the Hun. But the Germans also put out their propaganda as well. For example, this one, of course, designed to show that the British were just a bunch of grasping imperialists. And if you look at the map of Africa, at least, and Asia, it's kind of hard to argue against that, although, of course, it's always exaggerated to the detriment, to the at the expense of the country that is the target of all that. In this case, you have a British soldier or a British representative who apparently is using the Red Cross as a cover to funnel weapons to the front or against German enemies. And then this one, you have the fat British representative there who has waged war against the Boers or the farmers in South Africa, who has colonized England, who's in Egypt, who has dominated the Arabs, and who has oppressed for generations the Irish people. So again, the Germans are not, they're not without a very big target in the British themselves. And then there was the evolving culture of war. People had to learn a new way of understanding not what war was. War is always the last worst thing we should do. People understand that intellectually. But down here, people had to figure out a new way of understanding how this war was being fought. In other words, what were the new limitations, or were there limitations? And as World War I unfolded, it turned out that the old ways of what people thought, you can do this, but nothing more, all that went right out the window. The 19th century was the 19th century, and the 20th century was the 20th century. Trench warfare, the first curtain raising on that had occurred in the latter days of the Civil War outside of Petersburg and Fredericksburg, when European observers had watched the Union and Confederate Army and a standoff. It is chilling to know that 50 years later, in 1915, that trench warfare had caused the opposing forces to also come to a standoff. Barbed wire introduced a new element of difficulty in the war, especially for maneuver, obviously. The numbers of troops. World War I would see the introduction of the use of what's called colonial troops. Black Africans who are colonial subjects of the British, or Black Africans who are colonial subjects of the French, will be brought from Africa to Europe to watch Europeans act in a very uncivilized way. These same people who have been told that they have no civilization, that they are just slightly more than barbarians, they are watching this with their eyes open. They carry those lessons and those memories back to Africa with them, and those memories are seeds that get planted that will bear fruit a generation later after World War II. The evolving nature of warfare with the impact of machine guns, the sheer destructive power, the level that human beings are reduced to just to survive from moment to moment, living in trenches, sometimes filled with water with rats as big as dogs, having to do their morning ablutions and cook their food, and cholera, dysentery ridden, waterborne spaces. We are out there constantly in the cold. New kinds of injuries. Why? New kinds of injuries occurring because of new kinds of weapons causing them. And then the living organism of the earth that is ravaged, that is torn to pieces, that is shred by human science and ferocity. Do you know how much energy it takes? Just trying to imagine how much energy it takes to have a landscape be reduced to this, or to be altered to look like basically an earthbound moonscape. What species knowingly does this to the planet that it calls home? New kinds of medical technologies will have to be invented to deal with the new weapons caused by to deal with the new injuries caused by the new weapons that have never been seen before, to include the gas invented by Fritz Haber. From 1914 to 1918, this map shows you that if you look at this map of the Western Front, these lines generally will remain unmoved for the entire war. And you can see that the greater part of this, on the Western Front at least, on the Western Front, Belgium and France will bear the greatest burden for where the war is physically fought. We should take note of this right now, because that's why at the end of the war, when Woodrow Wilson goes to Europe talking about we want a just peace for everybody, the French people and Georges Clemenceau They're not interested in hearing a just peace for everybody because all they've known is deep, deep, deep injustice in the world's worst modern war. And I'll close with this. Part of the evolving, changing nature of war involved, for the first time in human history, human beings had the means of bombing each other from the air. Human beings had been aloft in balloons and gliders. In 1903, I mentioned last week that human beings go one step further because now they're flying intentionally, not depending upon nature, not depending upon good weather, not depending upon updrafts, but because they can start a machine and take off. It's called the airplane. But during World War I, the Germans will send these big rigid airships called Zeppelins to bomb London and bomb England. Now, in addition to the literal horrors of the battlefield, people in civilian areas also get pulled into the conflict, and they too, what would have been before safety in the rear area or safety on the home front, there is no safety on the home front. Now the home front itself becomes the front because of the possibilities and the extension of air power, or what they said in the Navy, the ability to project force abroad. This is a Zeppelin hovering over Westminster in 1915. Look, it wasn't very sophisticated. They would drop little bombs out of what they call the carriages or the undercarriage of these Zeppelins. But I just have to tell you that if you're the person below upon who the bomb is falling, you don't care how it's delivered. The main thing is that it's a bomb coming from the sky. So now you have to change your orientation of warfare. Warfare used to be very literal, right? Very horizontal, like there's you, then the enemy over there. Now, war is multidimensional. It's you and enemy in front of you, but also there's a third or a second dimension to it. And then those are all what eventually in World War II and after World War II will be called the EM spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, or today they call it command, control, communication, or C3I, command, control, communications, and intelligence. When you have rigid airships that are flying over your cities and you have no air defense, I mean, you never thought about air defense. Why? Because you never needed air defense. There's never been a threat called an air threat. Now, by the time you get to World War II, during the Battle of Britain, the British will respond with an air force because they know that airplanes can be a threat. So airplanes that can be a threat need airplanes to be a defensive instrument against that threat. That's why you have the Battle of Britain. But in World War I, the idea of air threat, again, that's why when in World War II, you'll see barrage balloons that look like blimps. They're not offensive. They're designed to confound, to confuse, and to thwart aerial attacks. But again, the changing dimensions of warfare cause people to rethink what war means. Now it's ground warfare, it's air warfare. Submarines mean it's on the ocean, but also beneath the ocean. You must reorient your entire understanding of what war is, where it's fought, and how it's fought. And then this residence assessed the damage after Suffolk was rocked by bomb attacks mounted by a German Zeppelin. They're very often called the Graf Zeppelin. I'm going to go ahead and stop right here because it's 10:45 and I do want to get to your questions. But look, these were lessons. The increasing sophistication and destructive power of these weapons, the mental or the psychological warfare, the gas that was used with such devastating consequences. All of these things should have, and I don't mean to say that planners in the post-war world didn't take them into account. They did. They did. But humanity collectively, because World War II came, we can only conclude that the lessons were learned and they were understood, but something between 1919 and 1939, even with all that they knew from World War I, something in those years still prevented humanity from not recreating World War I on an even larger, more horrific scale. So that's why I said these lessons of weapons and warfare and changes in the cultural warfare, they should have been unforgettable. They may have been, but they were not learned from. They were not learned from because we had World War II, and the only question that we have right now is, have we learned it enough to not have a third world war? We know that we've had a Cold War, but a third world war. And I suspect that the reason we haven't had a third world war is because we literally as an existential reality cannot afford risking annihilating ourselves from the planet. I'll take your questions.
I don't have anything in the chat, so you can either type comments or questions to me, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask Fred.
Fred, I was interested in your comments on yellow journalism and the rise of what we would think of as junk journalism in the before our current era, and maybe in the age of the muckrakers in the late 1800s. You know, the muckrakers were a form of junk in a way. They were considered junk at the time,
yes,
and yet they had this purple journalism, but in the cause of something that needed to be awakened. And so yellow journalism is really an interesting idea, and purple journalism, and that's really an interesting idea, that maybe we need the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that's the only way you get a discriminating reader out there of all these people who are learning to read, you know.
You know, you're right. I think that today, the people who are called muckrakers in the late 19th and the early 20th century, you're right. They could engage in hyperbole, but the person that comes to mind, not so much a journalist, but certainly somebody who would have been in the category of what muckrakers they were called then. Today, I think we would call them investigative journalists.
Yeah.
People who are dedicated to using, they focus on an issue where there's some suspicion, injustice, something being done, excesses, industry not being honest. And I'm thinking about Upton Sinclair in his book, The Jungle, because Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, it generated such a reaction that it led to laws being passed that govern the processing of food, health and safety, and food processing plants, because there's a reason why he called it the jungle. Okay, they were unsanitary, they were unsafe, they were horrific places for human beings and animals. And so all those kinds of things that expose those sort of things. Think about the work that Bob Woodward and Bernstein did with regard to the Watergate case. That was investigative journalism, right? So there's muckraking when it comes to politics. There's muckraking when it comes to the food industry with Upton Sinclair. And I think that at least in the case of the investigative journalists, they recognize, or they play by a set of rules called journalistic rules and ethics. So much of what's happening on Facebook today, everybody's their own self-proclaimed journalist, and they're posting things. And, you know, we have blogs, and some of them are very good, and I've read some very good blogs, but some of them are you just wonder, who are these people, and why aren't they under medical care?
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but I think that, you know, and I think with the changing nature and landscape of our newspapers, with print news going so much out, you know, going out of business, and I think over the last 3 years, you know what I think has really happened, at least from my estimation, over the last 3 years, we've discovered that with big news organizations being bought up by conglomerates, those who have you know, some political agendas, either left or right, that what has reemerged has been the importance of the local newspaper in the community. Now, sometimes those are part of big conglomerates too, but I know that I've noticed that there's a growing movement still online in many cases where local people get involved to report the news in their community. They're not relying upon the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, or the Washington Post. They do a great job, right? The Los Angeles Times, you follow the Chicago Trib, it's kind of like, you know, look, right of center. The New York Times and the Washington Post left of center. I think the Los Angeles Times is right of center. The Wall Street Journal is considered to be, you know, a more conservative newspaper. And the thing is, just like you said, a discriminating reader will partake of all of them to get a good cross-section and then critically think their way to a conclusion. But small town newspapers and small town journalists and podcasts and blogs have stepped in to fill the gap for what used to be done by the local newspapers to keep us up to date. On a larger historical arc, I know that for a long time, that branch or that institution called the Black Press, like the Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh Courier, or in the case of Jet Magazine or Ebony Magazine, they provided information for the Black community because larger newspapers weren't. So there's always room to counteract that, but people have to, in a democracy, have to be interested to participate to do so. But you're right. Those muckrakers did a wonderful thing. And I think that the investigative journalists today, I still value the investigative journalism. And I'm grateful for the ethics and the lessons of communication being taught by our communications department and schools of journalism like Annenberg and others that teach people that just because you can write, just because you can type doesn't mean you can write. Just because you can talk doesn't mean you can speak. Other questions?
I have another question about whether or not you'll be speaking about the Spanish flu and the Sedition Act next time.
Yes, I will.
Okay. That's it. That's all I have. So anybody else who wants to unmute or ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to go ahead.
Please feel free. You guys are so much more fun and interesting to talk to than my usual customers.
Well, I have a somewhat personal question as I've been listening to this and some of your other classes. I'm curious about, and sort of appalled, I haven't asked this before. Did your extensive knowledge of history come before, after, or during your commitment to the military service?
It came before.
Wow.
There's a story that I've sometimes told. I was in the Philippines. I was about maybe 7 or 8 years old. And you remember the old Woolworth stores?
Oh yeah.
My mother took me to an old Woolworth store, and they had this book sale going on, and there were 3 books. I had them on my shelf right behind me. Story of the U.S. Air Force, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which was about the Doolittle raid of April 1942, and the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. And because I was a kid and because I was me, she said, "I'm not going to buy you those books." Well, I threw a tantrum, and so she bought me the book. When I got home, my father looked at me. He went, "Boy, what on earth do you want to know about Adolf Hitler for?" I said, "When I read it, I'll let you know." Wow. So I had that interest in history even as a 7 or 8 year old, and then over the arc and dynamic of my life. And another thing too, Kim, I was in the Upward Bound program, which is why I'm in love with the Upward Bound program at Hope. I'm an Upward Bound kid, but when I was in Upward Bound that summer, one of the things I had to do, I was assigned a job to work for a guy named Jake Cox. Mr. Cox was the film librarian at Bowie State College's library. And so he said, I showed up at his office one day. He looked at me and went, "What are you doing here, boy?" And I said, "I don't know. They told me to come here and you put me to work." The basement of Bowie State College, you remember they had the old reel-to-reel canister films? The basement of Bowie State was filled with films from like 3,000 years ago. And there was dust, and they were thrown everywhere. They were dusty, dirty. He said, "Go downstairs and clean up that room." Well, I went downstairs in June and did not come up until August. I was in there every day because what I found out was that most of those films were history films, and a lot of them were speeches of Adolf Hitler. I couldn't understand a word of German, but I just got mesmerized by it. I said, "Who is this guy, and why do so many people follow him?" So while cleaning up, I would have those films running every day during the summer, 10, 12 hours a day. And the tragedy is that I learned to speak German, but I memorized phrases by the Nazis, which didn't go over too well in my neighborhood.
Right. Right.
I have a question, Fred. People still sort of glamorize war, and once you really see what it looks like, it just gives me shivers to think about sending young men off to war to do these things and the way they have to live and what they're expected to do. And then having a son who came back from Iraq and has PTSD and the tragedy after they get home. So I just have such a hard time with why war is made so glamorous and why men think the best thing they can do is go fight one. It's just, it's chilling.
Sue, that your comment, first of all, is deeply insightful and profound. And I remember when I was assigned as a student to read All Quiet on the Western Front. If you've ever read that book, it's about World War I, and it tells the story from the German point of view. And I think that the author did that on purpose to de-emphasize the fact that the Germans were the enemy, because the story unfolds, and by the time you get to to 1/3 of the way through the book, these are just 4 young men trying to survive day to day. They're like any other young person. They could be English, they could be Canadian, they could be American. These are 4 young people who are literally just trying to survive and take care of each other from one day to the next. And in that story, there's a character, every now and then, one of the young men flashes back to when they were in school. They had this teacher that was always talking about the glory of war and the glory of the fatherland and cavalry charges. And they think in the trenches how foolish it was to believe that guy. And in my own teaching of military history, I've always tried to make sure that the terrors of warfare were communicated. You know, so I have not been to combat. I have been nearly to combat, and that was scared enough during the Cold War. We had a few brushes with Soviet Bear bombers, you know, when I was deployed overseas. And there were a number of times where we were told to just, you know, pass out live ammunition. And we were almost going to go to war. I had friends of mine that went to Grenada that didn't come back. I had friends of mine that got blown up in Lebanon in 1983. And of course, for our Vietnam veterans, they know all about it. So that's why I think I said to you all that it is so easy for people that have never worn a uniform, who have never carried a pack, to pretend that this is somehow some glorious thing. I'm like General Colin Powell. If you gotta go to war, then go to war. But you should only go to war after you have exhausted every other available means to prevent war. And when you can't, then you go to war with a plan to go with overwhelming force, like we did in the first Gulf War. You go with overwhelming force, you achieve the objective, and then most importantly, you have an exit strategy to leave. And too many of our leaders do not have that understanding. They don't know what it means to wear a uniform. They don't know what it means to carry a pack. They don't know what it means to be associated with the possibility of death. So therefore, for them, it's very easy. It's far too easy to send other people's children to war. So in short, I agree with you. And I think that if I could have any kind of impact on future leadership, I'd love to have a requirement that they all have to have done at least a year or 2 in the military.
Fred, I imagine among your students at Hope now, if you asked a class to raise their hand if anybody in their family went to World War II, it wouldn't be that many. But in our 80 people right now who are watching this broadcast, I wonder how many people have some family memory of someone back in their family. I have a great uncle who left the farm, wound up dying of the Spanish flu before he ever left the fort in New Jersey. And this happened to many of our, but some story like that represents a memory in that family of World War I. That's right. Ask the people who have somebody in their family with a direct memory of World War I to wave their hand or something and see what we get from 80 people.
How many of you all that we're seeing right now have a memory of a family member who has memories of World War I? Anybody? I don't have any. There's a number of people waving their hands. Let me see.
Yeah.
Marilyn, John.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Kathleen.
6.
Yeah, Mike.
7.
Sue. Yeah. Jack and Mary.
I see a little under 10.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And you know, one of the things I don't hear people talking about as much, I guess maybe I should do something with this, is that, you know, I haven't really seen that much written or done on the culture of war. We always talk about strategy, tactics, you know, maneuvering and the battles and whatnot. And of course we have to discuss those, but the cultural war, we know what it means to do warfare. The cultural war changed for the world on August 6, 1945, when Enola Gay dropped that atomic bomb on Hiroshima. At that point, warfare as we knew it, how we had to think about it, what it meant, what it could do, we had to think about it in a totally different way. It wasn't just play destruction, now it's planetary survival. People had never spoken of warfare in those terms. Planetary survival, we always knew that it was, you know, existential, like, yeah, people die, that's terrible, and, you know, nations and people get past that. But now you're looking at the annihilation of the planet. That's why the world sat around holding its breath in October 1962, when it looked like the Americans and the Russians were about to do the most foolish thing in human history and really contemplate an exchange of nuclear weapons. And why, when they backed away from it, they backed away at a breakneck pace, thank God. So, go ahead, Kim.
Well, it's not related to that so much, but I'm just laughing because someone just put in the chat to me what I was literally about to say a minute ago, and what I've said to you in private emails before is Fred Johnson for president.
Man, what I tell my students that, the students I have right now, they weren't around in 2008, 2010. So I say, I'm gonna let you all know when I'm talking about something political, because I like, so they can know that I'm speaking with authority. I ran for Congress in 2008 and 2010. And I said, obviously I lost. That's why I'm still standing here talking to you. I don't know.
Try again.
Keep 2024 open for me.
Okay.
What other
questions,
questions do you all have? What comments do you have? What are your observations?
Just a question.
Gary.
Was that the start of the industrial complex in World War I?
What's that?
As Eisenhower referred to it in the 60s, the industrial complex was World War I manufacturing in the U.S., the start of it.
You know what? That's a really good question. And I'm gonna say yes, that was the start, and here's why. When the Great Depression started, of course, with the October 24th collapse of the stock market in 1929. But by 1934, America caught in the grip of that Great Depression. People, of course, understandably, just like with our Great Recession recently, were wondering, how did this happen? First question, how did this happen? And B, even more importantly, who was responsible? And when they started looking into how the economy had gotten entangled with European economies, and then the collapse of the European economies, when the Germans decided to take the Reichsmark under the Nazis and simply quit paying reparations, that had a residual effect on the British and French economy, who had borrowed money from us during World War I. In the interwar period, the American banks had loaned money to the German economy so that they could pay the debts to the British and French economies, who were paying us money that we loaned them. So it was all around a good deal for Wall Street. So when you look at it from that standpoint, Gary, you have American, and there was a book written in the 1930s called The Merchants of Death. There was this overarching belief that merchants and Wall Street bankers had somehow colluded, or either directly or inadvertently collaborated, to get the American economy dependent upon, make it, not just dedicated to profits, but had taken the cover of warfare and exploited it to their advantage, and made money by building weapons, by selling arms, and by loaning money, of course, at an interest rate. And so it was a good deal all around for them. Now, what that meant then, Eisenhower, as he's leaving office, is going to warn about private interests, particularly weapons manufacturers, who began to exercise too much influence in government with contracts. Congressmen want to be reelected. And one of the best ways of doing that is providing jobs for their district. So imagine the guy who's representing, or the man or the woman that's representing Boeing or Lockheed Martin. So if Lockheed Martin, can say, hey, Congressman so-and-so, I can contribute or make that campaign contribution, that is an exercise of power by an organization that individuals like you and I don't have, not individually. And this is what Eisenhower was warning against. And that same exercise in the political spectrum is what many people suspected was going on in the aftermath of World War I by the Wall Street banks and the arms manufacturers. Now, there was a 1934 commission launched called the Nye Commission, run by Gerald P. Nye, a progressive Republican senator from Nebraska, I think it was. They did not find any direct link to that, but the suspicion was still there. By the time you get to World War II, and then during the Cold War, Eisenhower could see the connection, and if anybody was qualified to make that observation, it was him, the former senior commander of Supreme Headquarters Allied European Forces. So yes, I think it extends back to World War I. Maybe I should run for office. I took a 30-second question and made a 5-minute response.
Okay, well, it's 11:06. Does anyone else have anything else they want to ask or share quickly?
Please ask a question. You all have no idea how much I miss you. If I don't talk to you, I got to go talk to those other people.
Well, this is off the subject, Fred. This is completely off the subject, and I've already talked a lot. But what do you think of Brian Berghoff's outlook in the upcoming election and as to what he's going through?
You know what? He's raised a lot of money, and he's got a lot of. I've noticed he's got a lot of sign. Thank you.
All right. Kit, do you want to wrap up for us? You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think Fred has done a really good job of wrapping up for himself. Thank you very much this morning.
You're welcome. Well, I look forward to being with you all next week, and we will get to the 1918 pandemic and see what they did right back then that clearly wasn't paid attention to now.
Amen. Awesome. Thanks so much. Goodbye, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Fred.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.